Imagine volunteering to fight for your country while your family members back home are sent to live and work in internment camps. It's difficult to imagine this atrocity taking place in a recent American history, but unfortunately, this was the harsh truth for many Japanese Americans during World War II. Maya Angelou once said, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." Our program tonight features New York Times bestselling author Daniel James Brown on his new book, Facing the Mountain, in conversation with Densho Executive Director Tom Ikeda. They help make sure this history is not forgotten and thus not lived again. Good evening and welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us. I'm Liz Brailsford, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Copies of Daniel's book, Facing the Mountain, along with signed book plates, are included with registration for tonight's webinar. If you would like to purchase an additional copy of Facing the Mountain, please visit the DMA's online store at shop.dma.org. I'd like to thank our partner for tonight's event, the Dallas Museum of Arts, Arts and Letters Live. We always enjoy partnering with them and look forward to doing so again soon. Additionally, I want to recognize the Japan American Society of Dallas-Fort Worth for their promotional partnership. The Council has a full schedule of virtual programs, so remember to check out our website at dfwworld.org for newly scheduled events. Now, I'd like to welcome a good friend of the Council's, Carolyn Best, to introduce our speakers for tonight's conversation. Carolyn is the Director of Arts and Letters Live, the Literary and Performing Arts Series at the Dallas Museum of Art, where she has worked for 24 years. Carolyn, thank you for your partnership and your friendship, and with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Liz. Arts and Letters Live is delighted to join forces with the World Affairs Council tonight on this special event. I'd like to thank supporters of Arts and Letters Live and the World Affairs Council for your continued generosity to both of our organizations this year. Arts and Letters Live's 30th season kickoff and virtual programs are presented by PNC, and major support is provided by the Hirsch Foundation. Now it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome Daniel James Brown in conversation with Tom Ikeda. Dan grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area and taught writing at San José State University and Stanford before becoming a writer and editor. He now writes narrative nonfiction books full-time and says he enjoys bringing compelling historical events to life as vividly and accurately as possible. Dan last appeared at Arts and Letters Live about 5 years ago, and that night stands out in my mind as a truly epic gathering of more than 600 people, when he shared insights about his book, The Boys in the Boat, which spent over 2.5 years on the New York Times bestseller list, and it's now in the process of being adapted as a major motion picture. Dan's latest book, and the focus, of course, of tonight's conversation, is Facing the Mountain, a gripping World War II saga of patriotism and courage. It uncovers the seldom told story of an Army unit almost entirely made up of second-generation Japanese Americans and the growing animosity toward Japanese Americans that followed the attack on Pearl Harbor. Author Timothy Egan praises the book by saying, quote, "Daniel James Brown has done it again. His rich, nuanced recreation of the dark years when thousands of our fellow citizens were incarcerated because of their ancestry is a must-read contribution to the history of the 20th century." End quote. Dan met our moderator tonight, Tom Ikeda, a little over 5 years ago at an awards ceremony where they were both being recognized. Their friendship, collaboration, and collective passion for unearthing stories from Japanese American history has borne fruit with this book, and Tom wrote the foreword for it. Tom has been the founder and executive director of Densho for 25 years, a Seattle-based nonprofit dedicated to collecting, preserving, and sharing Japanese American history and promoting social justice and equity. Tom says that this book will open hearts, and its lessons have never been more relevant than now. Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month carries emotional heft this year. And many of our local organizations, among the ones presenting tonight, are holding space for healing, commemoration, and dialogue. We'll kick off the evening tonight with a short video that powerfully and artistically introduces Facing the Mountain, and it was created by Tom's daughter, Tani Ikeda. After it finishes, we'll join Dan and Tom live in Seattle for their conversation. Many thanks for joining us.
By and large, they had grown up like other American boys. Baseball and football, they made plans to go to college or work in the family business or run the farm someday. It seemed as if the whole world lay before them. But within hours of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, all that changed. Within days, the FBI was banging on their doors. Within weeks, many of them would watch as their immigrant parents were forced to sell their homes. Within months, tens of thousands of them would be living in barracks behind barbed wire. This is the story of those young men, resisting, rising up, standing on principle, laying down their lives, enduring and prevailing. Penguin Random House presents Facing the Mountain, a true story of Japanese-American heroes in World War II by Daniel James Brown, read for you by Louis Ozawa.
Thank you, Carolyn, for those for the introduction and for showing that video. Yeah, before we start, Dan, I just want to tell you a quick story. I mean, about 5 months ago, you sent me an advanced reader's copy, and so I read that with Tani. We actually read it to each other out loud, and I just wanted, because I know you have daughters too, and Tani's 34, and it was just one of those bonding experiences for us to read the story, and she could see how moved I was at certain parts, and it was just a great chance to explain the history. So I just wanted to, and that's one of the reasons why she wanted to do that book trailer.
And I love that trailer. That's just a wonderfully creative and powerful way into what we're going to do tonight, I think.
Yeah, and I just want to let people in the audience know that so Dan and I are together, and it's so much fun to actually sit in the same room after all the Zoom meetings we've done. But I just want to let people know that we've both been vaccinated, and so we don't have to socially distance right now. But Dan, I want to just start. I mean, Carolyn mentioned how we met a little over 5 years ago at an awards ceremony. I just want to kind of start there because as Carolyn mentioned earlier, you wrote the book, The Boys in the Boat. And I had, read the book, and I was actually really excited to meet you because you were being honored, for The Boys in the Boat. The mayor of Seattle was going to give you an award, and that book was just so powerful in terms of, and I think a lot of the audience probably has read it also, but just your ability to tell such a powerful story with real history. And I remember, and I was there getting an award for Densho because I was, collecting and sharing the Japanese American stories. And we were actually sitting about this close to each other on stage. And we started talking about Japanese American history. And I remember you were genuinely interested in Japanese American history and the stories. Tell me what it was like for your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, this book was really born out of meeting you that day. As I sat there listening to you explain what you've done collecting all these oral histories over 25 years now. I just was intrigued. I've always been interested in Japanese American history for a variety of reasons, but I went home, and I think it was that night, I started looking at some of the clips, some of the interviews you've done over the years. And I spent the next several days just looking at dozens and dozens of these video recorded oral histories.
Oh, I remember that because you sent me emails every once in a while, and I would send you maybe, check out this story or check out that story. Because...
Exactly. And as I did that, I fell into them, and I'm a person that's all about story. Story is what really gets me going. And so many of these were really interesting, compelling stories. They were obviously all about Japanese Americans, but they were also the kinds of stories that I'm drawn to. A lot of them were about earnest young Americans confronting difficult times in the 1940s, and having to overcome the sets of obstacles that were presented to them, and doing so just through sheer force of will. There really was actually there was kind of a resonance for me with the Boys in the Boat story. I mean, obviously it's very different in many ways, but the core similarity is that I saw in those stories the same sort of struggle that ordinary Americans were going through, and the same sorts of values and attitudes that rose to meet those challenges and overcome them. So, over the course, as you know, of the next couple of years, I gradually whittled it down to a smaller number of people and began to develop what turned into this book.
Yeah, I mean, people have asked me because we've had actually hundreds of authors, filmmakers, podcasters, educators who have come to Densho, and I've talked to them about wanting to use materials to create something. And people have noticed I spend a lot more time with you, and the question is why. And part of this was I know the story so well because I almost come from it like from a micro standpoint. I've done over 250 oral histories, and sometimes I get buried in the detail. And it was interesting talking to you because you would talk about these broader themes that you saw that were coming out, and I remember just being intrigued with the discussions. But I also thought, okay, so how is he going to do this? When we were talking, I said, you asked me, is there one person, one family that you could focus on? And I said, no, I think it's going to take at least a dozen. And you did. You were able to whittle it down to at least 4.
Right.
And so talk about that process. How did you tell this very complicated story with only four main people?
Yeah, so I mean, 12 just wouldn't have worked. It's too unwieldy to try to tell a story with 12 protagonists. And so I needed a smaller number. What I finally settled on was I came to the realization that young Japanese American men of draft age, Nisei men, right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, they all faced a single dilemma. And that was that here they were, their families were being incarcerated. They were being forced out of their homes on the mainland. They were being forced to dispose of their possessions, give them away or sell them for pennies on the dollar. They were having to walk away from their schooling. Their parents were having to close their businesses or walk away from land they had been farming. And yet at the same time, like millions of other young American men, many of them wanted to sign up for the military and do something to serve their country. So what were they to do? Those who went down to the Selective Service Office discovered that they weren't allowed to enlist for the military because of their ancestry. They were prohibited from doing so. So there was this common dilemma that young men of that age, Japanese American men, faced. And so I found 4 whose stories, I think, when taken together and woven together, begin to shed some light on how the different ways that they could deal with that and the kinds of values and virtues that they demonstrated as they moved through the war years.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it was such a wise move because I think about the crux of a lot of the issues that Japanese Americans had to deal with, whether or not military service, resisting, revolved around oftentimes being in that 18 to 22
Right.
time frame. So that's really
and I should make clear that I mean the book is focused on these 4 young men, but it's really also about their families, their immigrant parents' experience coming from Japan and coming either to Hawaii or to the West Coast of the United States and trying to make their lives in this country. So the arc of the story really goes back to their immigrant roots and all the way through the war years and to the repercussions after the war for what they experienced during the war.
great. So let's start talking about the 4 men. And why don't we bring up the first image of Gordon Hirabayashi? And Gordon was someone who was raised in the Seattle area, so I know his story well. And here he is with at his wedding picture with Esther Schmo. Tell me about Gordon.
Yeah, so Gordon is a really interesting young man. He was a student at the University of Washington when World War II broke out. And right after Pearl Harbor, a curfew was imposed on anybody of Japanese ancestry living in Seattle. They had to be off the streets by 8 p.m. Gordon was a young man who lived his life according to principles, very strongly held principles. He didn't think that was right. So he began to deliberately defy the curfew. In fact, he began to document occasions when he was out after 8 p.m. And then when the time came for Japanese Americans in Seattle to get on buses and be taken away to these camps, Gordon didn't get on the bus. Instead, he sat down and he wrote a very detailed, well-reasoned statement outlining, laying out why he was defying the curfew and why he was refusing to be incarcerated on sort of broad constitutional grounds, making the arguments that this was illegal and unconstitutional. And he took that statement and he went downtown Seattle and he walked into the FBI offices in Seattle, handed them the statement and turned himself in. And then that began what turned out to be a series of legal battles that worked its way all the way up to the US Supreme Court. Gordon was in and out of jails and prisons throughout the rest of the war, but absolutely fascinating young man.
You know, and I love the detail in the book that you were able to bring out. And a lot of that came from the oral histories that Dencho and other people did. And so we thought it'd be interesting for the audience to actually see some of the primary source research that Dan did in terms of looking at oral histories. And so we're going to show a clip of Gordon when he is describing, you know, kind of that moment. I call it like an epiphany when he said, you know, I just have to ask a question. Is this right or wrong? And so he's at the University of Washington Library studying with some other, you know, white classmates. And there's a 8 p.m. curfew. And so it's a few minutes before 8 p.m. So let's watch this clip.
And then one day, I'm dashing home. Hey, Gordon, it's 5 to 8. I grab my stuff and it takes about 5 minutes to get home. So I'm just dashing home and it hit me. A question that I should have faced earlier, it just hit me. How come I'm dashing home and all your timekeepers are still there? It just needed the question to be raised. I knew I couldn't answer it, you know, without saying, I can't do it. I turned around and went back to the library. Hey, what's the matter? And I said, well, you guys are here. We got work to do. I said, I got work to do too. I decided if you guys are here, I'm gonna work with you. I'll go back when you guys are ready to go. Nobody turned me in. And I didn't take that until it hit me. And when it hit me, I knew, gosh, I can't do it. That's two-faced.
So that was that moment where he, you know, decided to defy the curfew. A few weeks later, he essentially asked that same question as, you know, as Japanese Americans got the orders to, you know, be rounded up and be removed. You know, he said the same thing that, you know, that just, you just have to ask a question. It's not right.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, I think it should be noted that there were many young men who resisted the incarceration of their families and themselves. And later when Japanese Americans were drafted, resisted the draft so long as their families were being incarcerated. So, so Gordon is sort of one voice of the resistance. He was particularly well suited, though, I think, for inclusion in the book because he lays out his case so clearly and he rests it on such fundamental constitutional principles that are pretty hard for anybody to argue with. Simply, for instance, that American citizens should not be incarcerated on the basis of their ethnicity, which seems obvious to us now, but simply was in fact what happened during the war. So he's he's also just a really, as you know from having talked to him, really interesting guy, a little quirky, but absolutely fascinating. And I think the readers are really going to enjoy his story.
No, I agree. He is. I mean, he's such a principled person, and in some ways unique because, I remember you talked about going to the FBI, and he actually thought there were going to be dozens and dozens of other, people actually opposing at that moment.
Right.
He was pretty unique. He was the only one at that initial moment. But
Right.
as you say later on in the camps, I think many other Japanese Americans started saying this is going too far.
Yeah.
And then, the opposition came out.
Yes.
So let's go to the next person. Let's show an image of Katsumiho. So we go from Seattle now to Hawaii, and here the story of the Japanese Americans. For me, it was very different. I knew more in terms of the mainland. Tell me Katsumiho and some of the stories of Japanese Americans in Hawaii.
Sure. So Katz grew up on Maui at a time when Maui, like most of the Hawaiian Islands, was run as basically one vast sugarcane plantation, sugarcanes and later pineapples. And the plantation system was racially stratified, brutal working conditions, particularly for first-generation immigrants from Japan who worked under absolutely brutal conditions in the cane fields. So Katz grew up in that environment. He was actually a student at the University of Hawaii when Pearl Harbor happened, though. And he actually witnessed the attack on Pearl Harbor from the roof of his residence hall. And because Katz was a member of the ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps, when he witnessed the attack on the base at Pearl Harbor, he and hundreds of other, mostly Japanese American young men, raced to the gymnasium there, or the armory, and assembled. And they became, that afternoon, they were formed into something called the Hawaii Territorial Guard. So that night, Katz found himself down on the Honolulu waterfront, patrolling against what everybody expected would be an invasion of Hawaii by Japanese imperial troops. He later went on to serve in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, but his first service was a very brief service in this Hawaii Territorial Guard.
Yeah, and just a note, the Japanese American experience in Hawaii was very different because they were the largest minority group, about a third of the population, right, versus on the mainland, they were in such a small percentage, right, of the population. So we're going to show a clip of, and I should mention it's, his name was Katsugo Miho. We always call him Katz because that was his nickname. And it's a clip that the University of Hawaii, the Center for Oral History, did of Katz Miho. And so let's show the clip of Katz talking about his time with the Hawaii Territorial Guard.
Our group of University of Hawaii students were dropped off as guards over area in the dark on 4-hour shifts. And for 2-3 nights in a row, we were serving as, I don't know what we would have done, because we were given a loaded rifle. We were given a loaded rifle with 5 rounds of ammunition. We didn't even know how to fire the gun. But we were given this rifle. We were told, you load it this way, and this is the way how you lock it in case anything happens. And to this day, I wonder, what was if anything happened was what they were referring to, because not that nothing happened, but what if anything had happened, what were we supposed to do, because we were not giving any kind of orders. A month and a half later, early in the morning, we got called up and said, hey, we're going to report down to Lanakila Intermediate School. And we woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning. They woke us up at 2 o'clock. And then finally, about 5:30, a truck came by to pick us up. We were all fully packed and everything. We dropped us off at Lanakila. We wondered what was going on. We found out that the whole battalion was assembled at Lanakila. And then Major Frazier, who was the acting commander of the battalion, came up and told us point blank, right straight in our face, he says, the reason why you are here this morning is because all you Americans or Japanese ancestry. I'm pretty sure he referred to it. Americans or Japanese ancestry. Because of your ethnic background, you are being discharged herein right off the bat, right as of now, you are being discharged from the Hawaiian Territory. Only the AJAs. I'm completely still shocked.
And just watching that, he is a good storyteller. And the first part, I just loved, kind of, his sort of bemused look about the absurdity of having these young men untrained with 5 bullets going out there and guarding
to defend against a Japanese invasion.
right. And what was it? In case something happens or something. So, but then the ending part, though, he talked about I call it a scene, kind of an experience that was very difficult for him and the others.
Yeah, I mean, these guys, imagine this, you're serving your country, and in the pre-dawn darkness, you're assembled on an athletic field in Honolulu and told to your face that you're no longer welcome to serve because of your Japanese ancestry. I mean, many of those young men could hear others crying in the darkness that morning. They were so shocked and so disappointed. And Katz was one of those who was extremely disappointed. He went back to Maui. His family ran a small hotel in Maui. So he went back to Maui and got a job as a carpenter. But he was so frustrated because he was working as a carpenter on these military bases that were being constructed on Maui as the U.S. military presence built up in Hawaii. But he wasn't able to actually join and to serve until a year later.
Yeah. I mean, at the top of the show, I mentioned how I read this book with my daughter, and there were that point where you described that scene at the end. I got choked up, and I think it that was one of probably a dozen places where it really hit me, and that was a powerful scene. So let's go now from. And I should mention, we first talked about Gordon, who had the courage to stand up to the government, and then we went to Katz, and the other two were members of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and we'll talk more about this with the next person, Rudy Tokiwa. So we're going from now Hawaii back to the mainland, down to California. So let's show a picture of Rudy. And it's a picture of him in uniform. He's in Europe. Rudy's the one in the front, where he actually captured some German soldiers and officers, because I think headquarters said we need to interrogate some people. So this is a picture of him bringing them in. It's a pretty amazing story that you captured. But tell me about Rudy and why he's in the story.
Yeah, so Rudy grew up on a farm in Salinas, California. After Pearl Harbor, his family was forced to leave the farm. They were taken first to the Salinas Rodeo grounds, and which was called an assembly center. And then from there, they were taken to one of these camps this one was the Poston camp in Arizona, and the whole family was incarcerated there. Rudy was one of the young men that there was quite a bit of debate within the Poston camp, as it were in other camps, about what the right thing to do was when Japanese Americans were finally offered an opportunity to serve in the U.S. military. Some felt very strongly that they should not serve so long as their families were being incarcerated. Others felt that well, perhaps if we serve, we'll earn some respect for Japanese Americans and we'll be treated better when we come back. So Rudy was one of those who decided to join what became the 442nd.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I love about your writing is you're able to capture the personality of these individuals. And I just want to mention, Rudy is one of my favorites, not just only in your book, but of the many men I've interviewed, because he has, what's the right word? He is such a interesting. We've talked about kind of like a rascal type of
yeah. Rudy's Army nickname was Punch Drunk. he tended to get in fights. He often didn't follow the rules real strictly. He was a real character. But he also had just this absolutely huge heart and cared very deeply about his family and about the other guys he was serving with. And that really comes through in the histories or the interviews you did with him. A lot of the clips that I watched, a lot of the interviews that I watched that you did with Rudy, I was really deeply moved by how he sort of wore his heart on his sleeve, and you could really feel his emotions as he talked about the things he had gone through.
You know, we talk a lot about the courage of the four men that you highlight, and Gordon, and then the three who in the 442nd. Yeah, I want you to talk a little bit, specifically about the campaign in the Vosges Mountains, because I think it kind of captures some of the, what the challenges that these men had to face.
Yeah, so let me back up just a little and say the 442nd was this all Japanese American, originally all volunteer, all Japanese American fighting unit that was finally formed in early 1943. As I said earlier, initially Japanese Americans were not allowed to enlist, but in early 1943, the Roosevelt administration reversed course and began to actively recruit Japanese Americans. Many of them came from Hawaii, others came from the mainland. Some of them, like Rudy, came out of the camps. After basic training, the 442nd was sent first to Italy, where they fought their way up the Italian boot. Then they were transferred to northern France, to an area along the French-German border called the Vosges Forest or the Vosges Mountains. And that was a deep, dark, sort of impenetrable series of forested mountains. In October of 1944, the 442nd was given the task of liberating a town called Bruyères, which was the important juncture of a railroad line and some highways. And it was rainy and cold and miserable. And after several days of very intense fighting, they did in fact liberate this French town. They moved beyond it deeper into the Vosges and liberated a town called Bifontaine and a town called Belmont. At the end of that, several days of extremely intense fighting, they were given leave to take a night or two to rest in a barn or a shed or wherever they could find.
And I just want to mention, and at this point, I mean, not only was it intense fighting, they took heavy casualties. I mean, I've talked to some military historians, and they said at this point they were probably what non-effective, because they had lost so many. They should have been pulled off the line at this point.
Right, their fighting capacity had been greatly degraded, and their numbers reduced enormously. But in the meantime, something had happened. A General Dahlquist had ordered units of the 141st Infantry Regiment, which was composed mostly of Texans, actually, and sometimes called the Texas Regiment. Dahlquist had ordered these mostly Texas young men too far into the Vosges, much further into the Vosges forest than he had reconnoitered. And they were cut off, surrounded on all sides, trapped on the end of a ridge line. And many of them were wounded. Some of them died. Some of them had gangrene. They had very little in the way of medical supplies, almost no food, no drinkable water. And over the course of several days, General Dahlquist became more and more desperate to get these guys out of there. So he sent numerous units from the 141st up to try to get through to these guys. None of them were able to do that. So at that point, he awakened the 442nd young men that we'd been talking about, who had been given time to rest, but didn't get much time to rest, as it turned out. He sent them up the mountain to try to get through to the Texas soldiers that were trapped up on this mountain. And as degraded as their fighting force already was, they fought through absolutely hellacious conditions, fighting their way up this mountainside over the course of several days, took even more casualties. And by the end of that campaign, they did in fact reach the Texas unit and get them down off the mountain. But there were so few survivors that, well, I think we'll show a clip that that describes it. The very few of them actually made it back down off the mountain.
Yeah, so we're going to show a clip of Rudy talking about kind of, it's called a retreat parade where General Dahlquist wanted to address the troops. And, at full strength, the 442nd would be about 4,000 men, 4 battalions. And on that day, there was less than 1 battalion left because after Bruyères, Bifontaine, the Rescue Lost Battalion, and an additional week, I mean, General Dahlquist ordered them to keep fighting, even though they were devastated. General Dahlquist wanted to address the troops, expecting probably more men than he saw. So let's see this clip of Rudy talking about that.
The 36th Division commander wanted the 442nd to pass in review. And he said, all personnel of the 442nd will pass in review. So the 442nd passes in review, and like I say, you got 3 battalions plus headquarters, and they don't even have a battalion out there passing in review. So General Dahlquist turned around and he said to the colonel, when I order everyone to pass in review, I mean the cooks and everybody will pass in review. And Chaplain Yamada said, this is the first time I saw the colonel cry. And he said, this is all I have left.
Yeah, I think of that clip. We've talked about Rudy's personality and who he also was. He was a pretty tough guy.
He was a very tough guy.
And I remember when he kind of broke down and got choked up and cried and that campaign, in some ways broke so many of their spirit and bodies of so many men. It was devastating.
It really was. And I mean, I think I told you before, but that clip, when I saw that clip, was one of the moments when I really decided to write this book, because I got choked up and I showed it to my wife. She got choked up. There's so much heart in that, and it's impossible to look away from it. And you really get a sense by listening to clips like that of what these guys went through, and how tough the fighting was and how much heart they put into it. Maybe this is a good time to mention that because they did rescue what became the Lost Battalion, decades later, Governor Conley made all the members of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team honorary Texans, which actually meant a lot to these guys because of what they'd done on that day, or those several days.
Right. And this is probably a good time to ask you the naming of the book, Facing the Mountain. Where did that come from? And just, a quick thing I didn't mention at the beginning, there's a picture of Mount Rainier behind us. We're in Seattle, and actually from our house, I have a view of Mount Rainier when I get up. So, but why Facing the Mountain?
It was actually my wife, Sharon, suggested it. I'm pretty bad with titles, but it really clicked with me once she came up with the phrase. There were several sort of levels and layers of meaning to it for me. One just sort of topographical fact is that in Italy and in northern France, both, these guys, they were always fighting their way up the side of some mountain. The Germans always had the high ground. The 442nd American guys were always having to fight uphill into the teeth of ferocious fire. So it made sense on that level. But more generally, to me, what it means is, as I said earlier, on December 6, 1941, these Japanese American families and their Japanese parents were proceeding with their lives in America, trying to reach whatever goals they had for their lives, to make the farm successful, or to make the business successful, or to graduate from UCLA or whatever. On December 7th, 1941, this mountain of problems arose in their path, and they had to get over it or around it some way. And that's really what the book is about, is how through the eyes of these four individuals and their families, what we can learn more generally about how Japanese Americans navigated the problem of getting over that mountain and onto a path beyond it.
Yeah, I really like the title. And so let's go to the fourth man that you highlighted. Let's have a picture of Fred Shiosaki. So Fred is from Spokane, Washington, and briefly in terms of some Japanese American history. So the West Coast, Washington State's up in the West Coast, up in the Northwest. But what the military did was they split Washington into two parts, Western Washington and Eastern Washington. With Western Washington, the Japanese Americans, with the majority, were rounded up and placed in camps. But Japanese Americans who lived in Eastern Washington weren't placed in camps. So talk about Fred and his role in the story.
Fred grew up in a neighborhood in Spokane called Hilliard, which was kind of a rough neighborhood. It was down by the railroad tracks, and it was a neighborhood mostly of immigrant families from all over the world. And I think partly because of that, a lot of racial slurs got thrown around amongst the kids in Hilliard. Fred was a young man who I think he didn't really like to fight. He was essentially a pretty gentle soul. But he would not abide racial slurs. And so he learned to fight, he learned to scrap early on. In fact, he was always coming home with his glasses broken. His family ran a laundry, and his poor father had to keep buying him new sets of eyeglasses because he was always coming home with his glasses broken. But Fred was one of these young men who, right after Pearl Harbor, tried to enlist, went down to the recruiting office in Spokane, like all the other kids in his high school, young men in his high school, and tried to enlist, and was told he couldn't. He was told he was in fact an enemy alien, which made no sense to him, of course, because he was an American. So that greatly discouraged him. He spent a year attending Gonzaga University in Spokane, feeling horrible because all the other young men were off to war. He was one of the very, very few young men on the campus that year. But a year later, when the 442nd was created, he signed up and served in the 442nd. He was one of, I should have mentioned in reference to Rudy that the effort to rescue the lost battalion was led by K Company and I Company of the 442nd. And those two companies took particularly heavy losses. Rudy and Fred were both members of K Company. So Fred was one of the guys that fought his way up that side of the mountain that day and lost a lot of friends in doing so.
So we're going to show a clip of Fred, and Fred is, this is after the war is over. He's returning from Europe, going back to Spokane, and he's taking the train. He's now in the Washington, D.C. area. So let's show this clip.
I was on the train by myself, and we stopped in Washington, D.C. And that's actually, from that railroad station, you could see the Capitol building. I'm sure that must have been the Union Station. And I was sitting there looking out the window, and this GI came out, I think he's a buck sergeant, and he stopped and he looked at me and he looked at my patch. He says, "Hey, you were the 442nd." Yeah. I says, "Were you at the Lost Battalion?" And I said, "Yeah, I was there." He says, "I was in there."
So he was one of the 200 men that you rescued.
Yeah, anyway, it's one of those things. I could just feel myself getting I was angry, God, and I turned to him and I said, "Do you know how many men we lost getting you guys out of there? You know how many of my friends died in there?" And well, he said, "You know, if you guys are in there, we'd have come after you. And I shook my head and I said, well, he said, anyway, I want to thank you, you know. He put out his hand and I turned away and looked out the window.
Yeah, so it was probably one of those Texas guys that came up and did this. And you know, when I interviewed Fred about this, he told me he wasn't really proud of that moment. You know, he in some ways felt ashamed, and he said it was irrational that he wouldn't shake his hand. But again, he talked about how angry he was because of, you know, again, just the devastation of seeing so much.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is these guys, like a lot of American service members during World War II or any war, he came home with a lot of psychological wounds as well as physical wounds. And it took a long while for some of these guys to work their way through a certain amount of resentment and a certain amount of anger about what had happened there. But Fred, you know, one of the things I really like about Fred is that unfortunately, Fred just passed away a couple of weeks ago. He was, of the four men who I profile in the book, Fred was the only one who was still alive when I began the project. And I really enjoyed spending time with Fred, getting to know him, sitting across a table from him, because his spirit was just so positive, that he clearly had worked through all those issues, and he had a really positive view of life, even when I met him and he was well into his 90s at that point. I really came to be very fond of him and to admire him a great deal.
Yeah, you know, so a quick story. So last week, you know, I gave a book to my dad, my 94-year-old dad, and he actually, even though he has cataracts, he read the book in 3 days.
Really?
And because he was just captivated. He says, "Oh, such a page turner." And even though he lived the experience, he said, "I learned so much, and it was great to see the stories." But after he read it, I asked him about Fred Shiosaki and his feelings, because my dad, you know, knew a lot of the veterans. They said, yeah, there were so many anger and issues and others. But he had an interesting experience in Texas I wanted to share. He was a little bit younger, you know, he's 94 today. And so he was training in Texas when the war ended. And it was a few months after the Rescue Lost Battalion. And he was in a store in, I think, the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And a woman behind the counter, you know, noticed that my dad's button was a little loose. And she said, are you Japanese American? My dad said, yes. And so she said, you know, please take your jacket off. And so she actually sewed his button and did this. And as my dad's telling this, I mean, he's just tearing up, because he said, the woman started telling him that, you know, it was either this woman's nephew or a cousin that was in the Lost Battalion. And so she knew what Japanese Americans had done. And so my dad was saying, you know, how appreciative, you know, Texans were of this. And so but he also understood why Fred was so angry and couldn't do that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's a real Texas connection here to this story that I really like. I've heard other anecdotal stories, people from Texas going out of their way to honor the 442nd guys.
And so I want to remind people that if they have questions, because I'm going to start diving into some of these questions. And you know, the first question comes from a Val. And, you know, it's kind of like what lessons from these heroes can be applied to our country today, which, you know, I embellish this a little bit more, because when you were writing this book, you know, the last 5 years, you know, our country was going through a lot. And a lot of the things that happened with Japanese Americans, you know, I like to say, rhymed with some of the current events. You know, things like, you know, the Muslim travel ban, where Muslims were being denied access to the United States, you know, for national security reasons, which was kind of a similar reason why Japanese Americans were placed in camps for military necessity, they said. And these were, you know, false reasons.
Right.
The other thing about just detention centers, you know, on the southern border, families were being detained and separated. And again, that was reminiscent of Japanese Americans and what happened during World War II. And then just the racism in terms of today, the anti-Asian hate and all that. And so, combining this with this question, all these things were happening. What lessons, what did you take away from this?
Yeah, I mean, I had the same experience the entire time I was writing this book. There were these echoes between what I was researching and the interviews I was viewing during the day, and I'd go home and watch, or go to the other room and watch the evening news, and there were all these echoes between the history I was reading about and what was happening. I think one of the lessons for me is just that in regards, particularly in regards to anti-Asian sentiment, which is, so obviously in the news right now and so important. I thought I knew a lot about anti-Asian rhetoric and sentiment, having grown up in California and having always had a lot of Asian friends growing up. But I realized in researching this book that there's a lot I didn't know about just how deep and that ran and what the history of it was. So when I was doing the research, I was reading about Chinese immigrants coming to California in the 1850s and encountering lynchings and burnings and being driven out of their homes. And then I was reading about this period where this notion of the yellow peril arose, where Asians were equated with rats and locusts and plagues and vermin and illness. And then when I was researching and thinking about Pearl Harbor, I realized those same images and tropes and ideas were just brought up again. They were already there, in American history. They were just recycled and brought up again and used again. And more recently, we've seen the same, again, images and ideas and phrases, associations with disease, for instance, being brought up and hurled against Asians. So what I'm saying is I learned from the experience of writing this book how deeply embedded that sort of systemic racism is, even if it seems under the surface most of the time. So when you look at these guys, when you look at this book, what I'm hoping is that the lesson people can take is by reading about these four young men and their families and the things they went through and the sacrifices they made for this country, that will begin to help, put to rest some of these idiotic racist tropes that have developed over the years. If you get to know people on a personal level, which is what I'm trying to do with this book, it's much harder to hate on them.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful way of doing it, because I think when I think about how I change how I think about things, I can be very intellectual and think about things, but I think it has to come from the heart. I mean,
It
just
does.
the way that you feel about things. And I think by you capturing these emotions so powerfully,
Well, I mean, storytelling can be powerful, and that's certainly what I'm always trying to do with whatever I'm writing about, is help people make a personal connection with some phase of history that they might not be fully familiar with.
So here's a question from John. He says, kicking the Japanese out of the exclusion zone was similar to the Nazis and Kristallnacht. And I think this might be an interesting question, because you actually did draw, because as we talked about the personal stories, you did talk about things that made people ponder things. I mean, think about things. And one is, you can answer this, but also I want to bring in the fact that you talked about how members of the 442nd helped liberate a death camp in Nazi Germany. So,
yeah, I mean, that's one of the ironies that's pretty spectacular in the book, and one of the moments in the book that I think people will find really interesting is that the field artillery unit of the 442nd was amongst the troops that came across the Dachau camp and its sub-camps in Bavaria in 1945. And in fact, these Japanese American troops were helping to liberate people who had been enslaved in the Dachau camps. And keeping in mind that for many of them, their own families back home were also living behind barbed wire, there was this obvious irony that they certainly was not lost on them, I'm sure, and that I think shouldn't be lost on history. And that brings up something else I want to mention, which is that in the book, I sometimes refer to these camps where Japanese Americans were incarcerated as concentration camps. And I just want to be very clear, first of all, that I'm not in any way equating those with these Nazi extermination camps and slave labor camps. But I think it's important to use honest language when talking about history. And the fact is that when the government incarcerated 100,000 Japanese Americans, they wrapped it up in a lot of language that was very fuzzy and soft. They called these camps in the desert relocation camps. They were concentration camps. They were designed to concentrate the population of people based on their ethnicity, confine them behind barbed wire, and separate them from the rest of the population. So I really think that it's important to use the term that's honest, but also for people to understand that I'm not equating them with the death camps of the Nazis.
Right. No, thank you for that explanation. Here's another question, from John's. Were the families that were detained ever compensated? So let me answer this question,
yeah.
because there's another Texas story here. They were in 1988. President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which offered an apology and compensation, $20,000 for any Japanese American who was incarcerated. And this was called the redress movement, the redress bill. The interesting thing is one of the main sponsors of this bill was at that time the Speaker of the House, Jim Wright, who was a Texas congressman. And Congressman Wright, or Speaker Wright, knew the story of the Lost Battalion. And as a Texan, he felt there was a debt to be repaid. So when it started bubbling up, through the community, he took a step forward and says, I want to be part of this. So they were compensated, and there was that Texan kind of connection.
I would just add also that Rudy Tokiwa was one of the people who was very involved in the redress movement.
Mm-hmm. And so, if you read the afterword in your book, there's a great little story.
There is.
And actually on your website, so I should mention, if you go to the danieljamesbrown.com website, the clips we showed, we selected from about, I think about 15 different clips. Mm-hmm. And so there's many more to look at. Here's another question. Your new book features young men of the same generation as the men of the Boys in the Boat. How did you come upon the idea, and how do the stories compare? And then also, she says, is there another generation or group of young adults that interests you for a new project?
Well, let me focus on the similarities between the Boys in the Boat, the young men there and the young men here primarily. I see a lot of similarities. I mean, I think people will first see the dissimilarities. The one is a book ostensibly about rowing with a bunch of white guys in a boat. This one's about a bunch of Japanese Americans at war, largely. But actually, I see a lot of commonality, primarily in the values and the virtues that these young men lived by. And I think they're keep in mind that these young Japanese Americans are another face of what we call the greatest generation. And there were certain sort of attitudes and values that were prevalent in those days that I think helped both sets of young men overcome the obstacles they had to. They valued humility, they valued perseverance, they valued resilience, they valued teamwork and camaraderie and working together. And I really see those are very much principal themes in The Boys in the Boat. And I think they're very much principal themes also in this book. So I do think that there's a lot of in common between the two stories.
And something else in addition to that I liked was you also talked about, especially at the end when you're kind of in some ways wrapping things up or giving perspective, the importance of the the immigrants coming in and bringing their values and their principles, and how that strengthens the country. Because in many ways, the men that you talked about, they also had Japanese values.
Yes, and I talk in the book about the fact that when, particularly the guys that were going into battle, and a battle like the Rescue of the Lost Battalion, they had a lot of traditional American values. They knew the ideals they were fighting for. They understood what was at stake with Nazism versus democracy. But they had grown up in Japanese families with Japanese parents. And so they did bring to that endeavor a lot of Japanese values, particularly about warfare. One of the things that was extremely notable in the research I was doing, listening to all these interviews, was that almost universally among the young men that signed up for the 442nd, the last thing their father said before they got on the bus or whatever to go off to basic training was, fight well, do your best, come home unwounded if you can, but whatever you do, don't bring shame on the family. Which mattered a lot to these young men, that traditional sort of value of the family's honor. Katsumiho and his brother argued all night long about which of them would be able to represent the family by joining the army.
Yeah, and part of that not bringing shame, I interviewed them, included that it was more honorable to die on the battlefield than bring shame.
Yes, and so they went into battle, many of them, with that attitude, which is, I think, part of why they became one of the most, if not the most decorated unit of its size in American military history. They fought incredibly well.
Yeah, so Dan, we went over time, and I really enjoyed this, and there's still other questions that we just weren't able to get to, but wanted to again thank you for this time. I just we kind of went off script a little bit and started talking.
Okay. That's good.
This was fun. So at this point, I think someone from the organization.
Hello, both of you. And we could have gone a lot longer, to be honest. This was an excellent discussion and a very important one. What a time in our history. And I thought those video interviews they were a great addition. So thanks so much to both of you. And just as a reminder to our audience, if you'd like to order additional copies of Facing the Mountain with a signed bookplate, they are available at the DMA store at shopdma.org, and the book will ship directly to you at home. Once again, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this evening. And thanks to all of our audience for joining us. And thanks to Carolyn Bess at the DMA. We're so happy to partner with you. So have a great evening. Good night.
Good night.